Professor Sarma, it is an honor and a privilege to count on your reflections in a debate that challenges us individually as members of the university community and collectively as a society aspiring to a better world. Professor Sarma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plantel, and what an honor it is for me to speak to you on this very wonderful occasion, this inauguration of the 25th anniversary. I will talk today about the future of education, and I'll start with some history and then share my views on the role of online and in-person education. So if you look at the history of our education system, it really goes back about 2,500 years. The first universities were actually in Asia to teach the Asian religions, but then they vanished around 500, 600 AD. And then around 900 AD, the first and still operational university that we know of started in Morocco, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. And then the Buddhist, the Christian, and other religious universities started. And so our tradition comes from monasteries. And that is the first strain that together creates our modern university, which is the monastic university. And if you look at these monasteries and you look at our universities today, there's still a similarity. And then in the about 200 years ago, we had the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, of course, you had to prepare people for work, but you also had to take care of the children. And so we started educating students at scale. And that led to a second strain of what has come to be today our modern educational system. And one of the things about industrial scale education is when you make parts in a factory, you need to test them because otherwise the customer is going to be upset. And in some sense, one of the important things that has happened to our education system is the importance of testing. Just as you test a part, you test the student before you release the student in the wild. The other thing is that parts need to be interchangeable, exchangeable. The same part has to fit into another car, the wheel has to be exchangeable. So we also standardize the students completely, right? And the education system, there's a little cartoon at the bottom on my left there, which shows how people like to joke. It's a little sad, really, that we take away all the creativity from these poor students. But what we're trying to produce is interchangeable parts. In some ways, before automation, human beings were the automatons, and that's how our education system has come to be. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and if you look at technology over the last 100, 50, 30, and 20 years, you can see that technology's adoption cycles have become much faster. Television may have taken 20, 30, 40 years to be adopted, but if you take something like TikTok, it's scaled within a couple of years. What that means is that the half-life of a lot of our jobs is really plummeting. In other words, your skills become out of date very quickly. And we've seen this during COVID. And there is this trend, which many of you know about, which is called the gig economy. The basic idea is, and this is a chart from The Economist, about how more and more people are becoming self-employed. And we are becoming more and more freelancers. Not all of us, but many of us. In fact, I do a lot of freelancing, right? So in my, although I'm a professor, like a lot of professors, we do a lot of consulting and so on. Now, what does that mean, though? What does it mean to the students that we're preparing? Well, it means a couple of things, but the most important thing is the student has to become the CEO of their own life, and the student has to become the chief learning officer, the chief marketing officer of their own life. They cannot any longer be an interchangeable part that you give to a factory and the factory plugs them in. These people have to become individuals with agency and with success on their mind, and they have to succeed on the strength of their abilities, not on their degrees, more and more. And then, of course, COVID-19 struck. I know that Spain was devastated by it. The United States is going through that right now. My thoughts are with you. I love Spain. I love Barcelona. It is, I wish I could be there in person with you. When I last met Dr. Planel and Dr. Imrich, we were talking about me coming there. It's a pity that we're doing this, It's because of COVID. And COVID has impacted so many industries. Some industries, well, Google, Zoom, I'm using Zoom right now. The valuation of Zoom exceeds the valuation of the top 10 airlines combined. How shocking is that? Online commerce, telecoms, online healthcare, because, it's harder to go to the hospital. But many industries are very badly affected. Retail, commercial real estate, airlines, hotels, restaurants, even, the concept of a city is going to break down because now people are used to working remotely. Why live in a downtown when you can live in a ski resort? In fact, there's a joke in America, we used to call them boom towns. And now we're talking about the growth of Zoom towns. You live in a ski resort, you work remotely, you go skiing in the evenings, But if you see this massive change in jobs, what you're also going to see is a massive job shift. And many of us have had to become very urgently experts in Zoom. We're seeing that. We are doing it ourselves. We're reskilling, right? And this is going to be the future. Now, if this is the future, and by the way, I do not believe that COVID-19 is a one-off. Keep in mind, this is the third or fourth, there's a third coronavirus, and many more viruses and diseases have come in the last 20 years, like Ebola. We've had MERS and SARS, which are the previous coronaviruses, but then we have climate change, we have political unrest, we have refugee issues. So we have to get ready. Extreme weather is the other one. So we have to get ready to really adapt to a new normal. And for us to adapt to this new normal, we have to get away from our model of human beings as interchangeable parts. The future cannot be one in which we cut young people's dreams to fit what we want. The future has to be that we need to give these young people knowledge and agency to succeed in the future. And I say young people, but I mean people of all ages, really, because as you will see when I talk about it, we will all have to retool. We have to prepare young people to become the CEOs of their lives, and we have to become the CEOs of our lives. We have to retool on an ongoing basis to stay competitive in a very rapidly changing economy. Now, think about medicine. Think of medicine before the 20th century and the 19th century. We didn't have biochemistry, we didn't have genetics, we didn't have x-rays, we didn't have extensive understanding of human physiology. Blood types was even new. We were figuring that stuff. We certainly didn't have antibiotics. Can you imagine we fought 2 world wars without antibiotics, right? So that's medicine before. I will say, it is my view, that education today is in the same place today that medicine was at the turn of the century, the last century. In other words, we haven't really understood how the brain works and we haven't applied it. The good news is we're beginning to understand how the brain works. And it's actually fascinating. I tell you, if there is one thing, you can spend a few hours wasting your time, go read on Wikipedia or in some magazine about how the brain works. It's quite magnificent. It is such a beautiful thing. In my view, the most beautiful and complicated thing in the world is not in the stars, it's not in the skies, it is inside each of us. It's in our little children, it's in our friends. And we are understanding how the brain works. And, we understand, for example, where empathy and insight and emotion and morality and intuition, all these things come from. The red piece in the front of the brain, that is called the prefrontal cortex, PFC. And that's where many of these functions come from. It is the CEO of your brain. It is something you have that our cousins, the apes, don't have, right? It is the CEO. It is the number one important thing. And then behind that are all sorts of other things. You have things like the limbic system, which I'll refer to later on, which tells us about emotions and safety and things like that, the reward system. We're understanding all these things. Why is this happening now? It's happening because of technology, actually. It's happening because we're understanding how to image brains. There's a beautiful history starting with Mossy. Mossy showed that you can determine which part of the brain is active by just measuring the blood flow there. It's hard to measure blood flow, but through a series of discoveries, we found that you can measure blood flow through an MRI because blood, when it carries oxygen, repels a magnetic field. And so with that, you can see which part of the brain is active during which activity. Now, based on all that, honestly, if you had to redesign the classroom today, and of course, WOC is a new university. It's only, a couple of decades old. You were designed in a new way, but traditional universities, including mine, MIT, are based on a very old model. And that old model is 700 years to 1,000 years old. And in that old model, if you look at it, nothing has changed. We're still giving lectures. And if you look at this picture of the University of Bologna from 1308, and you look at this gentleman in the blue robe, he is sleeping like some of my students do when they get bored of my lecture, right? And you can see that these two are talking to each other, and this guy is looking at his Facebook feed. So nothing has changed in 700 years. But what is fundamentally even more worrisome is an assumption about learning. And the assumption is that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And that's a very unfortunate assumption. And the reason that's unfortunate is because the human brain should really be treated as an organism that grows. If you have a puppy, you don't give it food in the beginning of the week and say you're done. You have to give the puppy food when it wants food. You have to give it play when it wants play. But we, in our factory model, have ignored that. And we just declare victory when the professor has given the lecture and walked off. And we don't pay attention to the fact that the student has to take these little tidbits of information and organize them into a treasury that will serve him or her well for life. And if you actually think about it that way, you begin to realize that it's actually more complicated. You see, the way the brain works, you remember I pointed at the forehead and I said that's called the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, right? You can think of that prefrontal cortex as a little cartoon. And the cartoon I use is that of a leprechaun, just because leprechauns are cute, all right? And the leprechaun, what this leprechaun does is every time your eyes and your ears come to knowledge, or if you're visually impaired, your fingers, when you come across a little bit of knowledge, the leprechaun goes and picks up that stuff, has to quickly run back and then recast the information in a way that makes sense to you and then put it away. Now, it turns out that's a very tiring task. And when the leprechaun is doing that, by the way, just to remind you, the leprechaun is the executive function, the CEO. And this action of recasting information is what we variously call consolidation, integration, sense-making, saliency, why is this important, connecting the dots. Now, after about 10 minutes, you know what happens? The leprechaun goes to sleep because he needs a rest. There's only so much he can do. Now, when that going to sleep happens, really what the brain is doing is it's connecting the dot. It's digesting the information. And the technical term for this is it's called mind wandering. Literally, the brain has to wander after 10 minutes. But think about it, every lecture in every classroom today is 45 minutes, 90 minutes, 1 hour. And at 10 minutes, you've lost the students. And that's because of nature. And no amount of shaking your finger at the student is going to change that. Remember, the mind is not a sheet of paper for the professor to write on. It only works by self-service when it is inspired. And there are a lot of philosophers who've discovered this, written about it even before we knew the science. You know, Thoreau, Alcott, Emerson, Maria Montessori, she sort of recognized this without articulating the science behind it. And Jiddu Krishnamurti, for those of you who follow philosophy, right? We've known this for a long time. We now know so many things. We know how mind wandering occurs. We understand how memory works. We understand, and there are all these principles we should be applying to learning. And we have steadfastly ignored them because the freight train of learning is very hard to stop. And we're so convinced what we're doing is right, and we're so regulated, we don't change it. Now, if you take all these lessons and start applying them, you would teach completely differently. For example, this is something called, this combines 2 or 3 principles. But it turns out, if you look at the red chart, look at the red line, if you eat quickly, well, next day, you know what you're going to do with it, right? Similarly, learning. If you learn very quickly, as if you're putting a lot of food in your mouth, it's not going to last in your body very long. For long-lasting learning, you actually want to do short chunks. You want to learn over a long time, slowly, and you want to repeat things. And then you get long-lasting learning. And that is applying principles like spaced retrieval. Hermann Ebbinghaus is the scientist who many decades ago, actually more than 100 years ago, discovered that the path to remembrance is through forgetting. In fact, forgetting is the body's signal, the brain's signal to itself that if I'm reminded of this, I'm actually going to remember it longer. Yet every time a student forgets, we get upset with them. And we never give people the chance to forget because we quickly do an exam and move on. But forgetting is actually a very fundamental part of learning. Here's another one. Let us say you're learning something in mathematics, like how to calculate the volume of a sphere and how to calculate the volume of a cone and how to calculate the volume of a cylinder. Every book has a chapter on spheres, a chapter on cones, and a chapter on cylinders. But all the science tells us you're better off doing cylinder, sphere, cone, and mixing it up. And the reason is every time you have to do a different problem, you have to forget the old program, upload the new method, and use it. And it's in the uploading that the memory occurs. And you can see we ignore it in the classroom, right? It's fascinating how many lessons we know. Here's another one. There was research at MIT that showed that that when they put EEGs on students' brain and they did a study to see how students learn, and they found that there is a certain brain pattern that leads to better learning. And a professor, Charan Ranganath in the University of California, showed what that emotion is. He showed that we learn better when we're curious. Curiosity is the hunger of learning. And the saliva of learning is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. So if you make students curious, they will learn, end of story. That's all you have to do. And where will they learn it? They can learn it online, right? So we'll come to online learning in a second. I have a few more slides. Here's another one. When you learn something with your mind, if you do it with your hand, you learn it better. That's a fascinating thing, right? Learning with your hands is important, but when you do something with it, you learn it better. That's called embodied cognition. Now, all these principles, by the way, I wrote a book about it. It's called Grasp, and it came out a couple of months ago. But if you take all these principles and put them on a table, and you see what do we do in the on-site classroom, what do we do online, and what do we not do well, the tragedy today is we waste on-site regular classrooms to do lectures. And all the other things, and the reason is, because we want to test the product for the exams, right? All the other things we don't do well at all. It's a tragedy. And actually today during COVID, the tragedy is worse because we've taken those lectures and we're doing them through Zoom. The right way to do it is to create
translation,
asynchronous videos.
Universal genetic code, ribosomes, all of it.
This man is Eric Lander. He's an MIT Harvard professor. He is led one of the two teams that sequence the human genome. If you're going to learn biology, you might as well watch this man. And if you watch him asynchronously, then the beauty is that you can do a lot more things than you can do if you just did a Zoom lecture. So now let's look at what the future is going to look like. The future to me is going to look like this. These lectures that we do in person, they have to go online. An online lecture can be paused, it can be fast forwarded, you can consume it slowly, you can interrupt it, you can do double speed. And all the things that we waste the classroom for today, right? And all these other tricks, all the cognitive tricks, you can actually apply online. Retrieval effects, spaced repetition, interleaving. By the way, Duolingo, Babbel, all these software programs use this. All the programs that we use for learning languages, they use so many of these tricks. You can do all of that online. And online does it better than the lecture. And this is where WOC comes in. You were designed from the beginning to go this route. You were visionary, right? In fact, most classrooms are wasted. What should classrooms do then? What should MIT be doing? And what have we been doing for the last few years? We've been saying the things that you cannot do online, we will do in the classroom. That is, build some context, maybe work on curiosity. There's a lot of work on coaching, hands-on learning. And the beauty for WOC is that the future is many of the things that I have in the left column at the bottom can actually happen through internships, apprenticeships, and jobs. So I think that the future is going to be a lot of online, a lot of connections with companies where you can do internships, and universities that have the courage to reshape themselves, to focus on the things that we cannot do online, and to push online the things that we can do much better online. And that is a multidimensional, what I call flipped classroom, right? People have called this a flipped classroom, but I'm calling this a multidimensional flipped classroom. It's a complete re-examination of how universities ought to operate. When we come back from COVID, We have to make the classroom count. So I'm going to end with this last slide and just say that universities are in a crisis right now, because when we all return from COVID, I hope to God we don't stare at each other and say, my God, we could have done this over Zoom. I hope that the universities, the regular universities, the MITs, the Harvards, the traditional universities will become places of action, creation, and impact. But I think the future belongs to online universities that strike deals with companies, internships, apprenticeships. And so again, it is a great pleasure for me to speak to your historic university, to your audience. And Dr. Planell, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarma, for such an inspiring lecture. Thank you very much again. And that was really, your talk was inspiring what we are doing and in the direction we should be moving forward.